to Design 101 for Developers. My name is Derek Cash-Peterson. I'm a principal architect for Simpraxis Consulting. We're a small consulting organization based out of Boston. And I've been a professional developer since 1999. I started as a front-end HTML, CSS developer. And I've been working with SharePoint since about 2006, back when they had web content management functionality that they pulled in from a tool called Microsoft Content Management Server. And throughout that time, I really specialize in design and branding and UX development. So as you can see here are some links of how to get in touch with me. The best way to get access to these things, to the deck or to any information that I'm presenting today is either on my Twitter or my link or my blog or my GitHub. And if you want to reach out, feel free to reach out. So I wanted to take a minute and just share with folks what we're going to cover today. This is really meant to be a 101 level course for developers to learn a little bit about design so that they can work in better partnership with the designers or the UX developers or designers that they may be working with. And so I want to take a quick look today at some basic user experience methodologies or design principles, talk about what makes a good user experience. We're going to talk about the major tenets of responsive design and accessibility. And then finally, we're going to look at the Fluent UI, and hopefully we have time at the end for a few questions. So I'm going to start by painting with a very broad brush, and I mean no disrespect with this, but designers in general are trained to make beautiful ththings. They know the difference between Arial and Helvetica. They know when they're supposed to use each one and when it works. They understand that the use case of picking the right shade of blue means one thing, versus another. And all of these things are very, very important. And they're required to make a user experience that works for the end user and relates well to the message and the voice of the company that they're trying to represent. But they are not always experienced in the technology that's being used to build the component that they have to design, or the trade-offs that may need to happen as a result of using a specific piece of technology or a specific framework or a specific application. And that's not necessarily their job, right? Their job is to come up with the experience for the user to help them achieve their goals. And it's our job as developers to really help make that vision happen. Developers, on the other hand, make things functional, but they are not necessarily beautiful. Developers don't necessarily understand or care about the different fonts involved, the different font choices, the placement, the different colors. And this isn't a knock on developers. Without the developers, none of these beautiful things that are getting designed would ever get created. We'd still be back in the old days of Dreamweaver and Front Page and WYSIWYG content editors. When developers look at code, they see the elegance in making the code more modular and making it reusable. And they see the art of performance tuning and load times. Developers really excel at making these designs tangible. And so to illustrate this point, I was talking with a friend of mine who's a designer, and they're a product manager working on a web-based application. And she was working on a piece of functionality that had been handed off to the developers. And she had given the design to them, and they had implemented it. And when the final product came back out of development, she took one look at it and she realized that there are two different colors of blue, right? The navigation text was one color and the arrow next to the text was another color. Those arrows in the navigation were larger than they were in the design, and they threw the balance off on the alignment of the content. And so while these things may not necessarily seem like a big deal to a developer or something that someone may never have seen, they do make a huge difference when it comes to the user experience. Users may not be able to pinpoint exactly what's wrong with something, but they will look at it, they will recognize that something just isn't right. And so the purpose of today's conversation is really the marrying of design and development. Because, and this is one of my favorite quotes from Steve Jobs, is the design is not just what it looks like and what it feels like. Design is also how it works. And that's why when you pick up an Apple device, you notice that it's usually pretty user-friendly, that you can figure out how to use it in a matter of seconds. You know, my son, I have a 12-year-old son, and when he was 2 years old, he was able to figure out how to turn on the iPad, find his PBS app, and watch his PBS videos with little to no instruction from me. And it's that simplicity of design as well as functionality that helps make all of this work in partnership together. All right, so now that I've set the stage, let's talk about some of those basic design principles. One of my favorite organizations, the Nielsen Norman Group, published an article about the 10 usability principles for design, for UX design. And this is pretty much an eye chart. There's a link to the article here and in the resources at the end of this slide deck. But we're going to focus on my favorite 5. And we're going to go in and talk a little bit about each one of these. So the first one is ensure that you're matching the system and the real world. And what this boils down to for a developer is making sure that you're not reinventing the wheel. Conventions and standards exist for a reason because they're easy to decode and that users have come to expect a certain level of functionality. So for instance, the save button on applications didn't become a floppy disk because somebody decided it would be a floppy disk. It sort of evolved as a standard over time. So you don't necessarily need to add a crazy save button that has a different icon. That's really just reinventing the wheel when the user is essentially expecting either the word save or a floppy disk icon. Using real world language. So making sure that as you are writing introductory text or you're writing instructions for your application or your web part, that you really keep in mind the audience of the people that are going to be using the app and using language that they can understand. Because if you're writing instructions at a PhD level, then they're not necessarily going to be able to understand it. So no matter how elegant your application is, if the instructions aren't readable and accessible, then it's not really useful for those users. They're not going to get it. And finally, following a real world order. Back to that point of sort of convention and standard, when you use an e-commerce application like Amazon or you're shopping at Target or what have you, there's a real world flow and a real world order to how you process that. You go, you view your products, you search, you find your products, you add them to your cart, you view your cart, you check out, you review your cart, you add a shipping address. Then after you add a shipping address, you add a billing address. Why? Because if you change your shipping address to something different, the shipping costs might change. And so there's a real world order. So make sure that as you're developing an application, you really stop and think about what is the natural progression of this and not think in the mindset of my application and how my application is going to work with this. The next tenet is user control and freedom. So users on the web are just like all the rest of us. We don't like to be controlled and we don't like to be told what to do. So it's really important that we provide gentle guides to our users. And in doing so, we provide a very clear path for them to follow, but not make that path so rigid that they can't get out of it. And to that point, providing an emergency exit for them. So for instance, you're building a Power App and there's a 6-step process that you're working through that. So it could be that your user goes through and adds information on step 1 and then gets to step 3 and realizes that all of a sudden that they made a mistake on step 1 and they need to go back. They need to have that ability to then, traverse that content and go back to step 1 or cancel out of the experience altogether because they realized that this wasn't the right place for them to go. And also, don't rely on a series of dialogues. Don't rely on anything that's rigid and sequential that keeps the user locked in their space. And just as important, and I didn't write it down on the slide, is if you are moving your users between different slides or different frames or pages, make sure that you save that information in state, because at no point does anybody ever want to jump back to step 1 and realize that they have to re-enter the information that they entered for step 2 and step 3. That's a short way for a user to tap out of your application and just simply say, this is too much work for me. Another one of the tenets is consistency and standards. So back to that conversation that I was having before about the user experience for a shopping cart, right? Those are standards in how things operate. It's important for you when you're developing your application to provide very clear and consistent layout for your app. Make sure that things line up, right? Make sure that the spacing is there for your headers. Make sure that, everything aligns on the same line on the left. Make sure your buttons all line up. So if you've got a list of information where you've got a title and an edit button and a save button and a cancel button, make sure that all those edit buttons line up. Make sure all those save buttons line up. And it's these sort of simple little things when you're doing development that can actually make a huge impact on your user experience, because having them be jagged all over the place is one of those things that sort of sets the user's brain just off askew a little bit, that they have to keep looking at things to find what they're trying to do. Another point is to not move things around in the UI. So as you are, transitioning from maybe one page to another, ensure that you're keeping that level of consistency, that the cancel button is always in the same spot, that the next button is always in the same spot. And provide a standard way to do things. Now, remember, back in the old days in 2000, 2001, people were putting their logos anywhere they wanted on their websites. But today, it's become and evolved into a standard where the logo goes in the top left-hand corner of the page. And that's just sort of the way it's done, and users have come to expect that. In addition to having the logo there, that logo has also become the de facto link to the homepage. So when you click on a website and all of a sudden you go to click on the logo and it doesn't link you back to the homepage where you were, or at the top level of the page, it sort of disorients the users and they're not really sure what to expect. So given those sort of conventions of different websites, it's important for you to take those into account and just think about your own browsing experience and your own expectations on different things. Now, as a developer, this next one is near and dear to my heart, error prevention. And I'm not talking about throwing a try-catch statement around your code. You should do that by default, and I shouldn't need to call that out. It's really more around, in your user experience, trying to minimize the kinds of errors that your users may encounter in your application. So the first would be to eliminate some error-prone conditions. For instance, if you have if you're writing an application that needs to accept a telephone number and store it into an ERP system. Now, that phone number needs to be in a very specific format: parentheses, 3 numbers, close parentheses, space, 3 numbers, dash 4 numbers. Now, you could just leave a blank text box and throw out an error if something doesn't hit a very specific pattern. You could give some instruction text. That's a little bit better. You could also write a regex that detected what the user put in and tried to fix it for them. Or you could break it up into 3 different boxes. Any of those models would provide you with the ability to try to minimize the kind of errors that a user might put in if just given a blank text box. And so it's really about thinking, thinking that extra step through to try to make sure that your users aren't necessarily, that they're not putting in bad data, that they're not, getting errors for things that we can prevent. The other is to simplify the user experience, right? Simplify the user input. How many times have you been to a site that asks you to enter your username or your email address? If I'm on a site and I'm authenticated, chances are that site knows my first name, my last name, my username, and my email address. There's no reason in any interaction with that system I should ever have to type my email address in again. And the same thing goes for that example of the shopping cart or the shipping log. This day and age, there are web services out there that provide matching for cities and states based on postal codes. And so instead of a form where you ask your user to enter in a street, a city, a state, and a postal code, how about ask them for their street address, because that's needed, and then ask them for their zip code. And then based on the zip code, pre-populate a drop down with city and state or country or whatever, whatever fits your use case. Now, those should be changeable because the web service may make a mistake, but really thinking about simplifying that user input, because not only does it eliminate errors, but it also, eliminates steps for your users, which, streamlines their process. And the other part is ensuring that you have clear error messages. We've all been to websites or, clicked through forms where we screwed something up. Maybe it was a password and we didn't meet the criteria, but it doesn't clearly identify that that was the issue, or that the issue, what the issue is. So what I like to do, especially in my forms-based applications, is I like to make sure that not only are my, when an error occurs on a form, to highlight the form field with an error message at the form field level. I also like to redirect the user to the top of the page so that they can indicate that something has happened, right? It just doesn't do some validation and leave you at the bottom of the page with the submit form, because if it's a long form, you may not know that you're, half a page up and there's an error. So by bringing the user to the top of the page, it indicates that something has happened. And then also at the top of the page, I like to leave a list, a summary list of things that need to be fixed with maybe some more detail around what the actual error is. Again, all of this is to keep your users from being frustrated, ease the friction of using your application or your web part or whatever that happens to be. And a lot of these things are actually relatively simple for us to add to our code to be part of that system. And finally, recognition rather than recall, right? And this really boils down to minimizing the mental burden on our users, whether it be how they decode the web application that they're using, how they make use of it, where the buttons are, sort of streamlining their process. So, the main point here is don't make users remember things on other screens. So in the example of the shipping cart, for instance, if you've got one screen that has shipping address and one screen that has a billing address, the first thing you ask on the billing address is this the same as the shipping address? Well, I know it's just one screen, but maybe if you move or present the shipping address at the top of the billing screen, they can reference it visually very quickly, go, oh, yep, that's what I entered, that's correct. And then they can say, yep, save as other. And then if it's wrong, they've already provided the information that you can jump back a step to one of the other tenants that we talked about and actually fix that error. And finally, if you need to make sure that your instructions are visible and easily retrievable at any point in the application, and more importantly, that they're contextual. If there's information and instructions about a certain page on a form, it should be relevant on that page of the form and be visible on that page of the form quickly and easily. And I know this is a lot of information to sort of process. I really do recommend that you check out the Nielsen Norman article at the end of this session, and go back and take a look at it, because it really does provide a lot more detail here and gets you as a developer in the space of sort of thinking about user experience and how users interact with systems as a whole, and not just how we as developers interact with the system that we're building. Now I want to talk quickly about what makes a good user experience. So we talked about some of the tenets of good user experience and user experience methodologies. And now, how do we take those and process those into actually creating an application that's usable? The first is making sure that your application is consistent, right? Making sure that the buttons are in the right place. And that they're consistent across the application. I gave you an example in the last section about making sure that all of your icons line up. That sounds super simple, but the visually making sure that that's the place in your brain as you're looking at the application that your users go to figure out where they save, where they edit, where they cancel, that all makes that all makes for a really good user experience. The next thing is making sure that it's readable. And there's a lot of talk about readability, especially as you start talking about responsive design. It's important to make sure that your type size is visible. Back in the old days when I started doing this kind of work, the designers were very big on making type that was 10 or 11 or maybe even 12 pixels. I never created a website with more than 12 pixels for body text. And over the years that has sort of been that has its time and its place, but generally that doesn't make for good readability. So having a little bit larger font size, because as you start making your application responsive, you'll notice that those font sizes change, and depending on what device you're on, you don't want to have to pull out the magnifying glass in order to read your content. Also, and this is sort of pushed to the side a lot when developers think about readability, is the max width of your text. So, having a very long, open, full screen web part that has text running all the way across the screen isn't necessarily the best user experience. So making sure that you keep a reasonably sized window for your content is really important as well. And finally, making sure that your application is intuitive. And that's sort of a nebulous term, right? What's intuitive to you is not necessarily what's intuitive to all users. So sometimes it might actually help to get some feedback. Get feedback from your UX designer. Get feedback from users that aren't part of your development group. Developers think about applications in the way that they build them. So, I know I write code and I write applications, and I think to myself, oh yeah, I know how to use this because I built it. This is super simple. But at the end of the day, not everyone thinks like me. And it's important to always get another set of eyes to get a look at things. So we've talked about, we've set the stage here, right? We've talked about the tenets of good user experience methodology. We've talked about what makes a good user experience. Now I want to move into things that are a little more tangible for us as developers and how we do our jobs. So I want to talk about responsive design. And at its core, responsive design is using HTML and CSS to resize, hide, shrink, enlarge, whatever, different components across devices, right? It is our ability using HTML and CSS to change the user experience so that it works better and is more usable on different devices. And the way I always recommend doing this is a mobile first approach. Now, back in the day when we first started doing responsive design, most people were working on desktops. Most people were working on laptops that had larger screens. And so we really took a desktop down approach. And what it turned out is that that actually took a lot more work and a lot more code than it did to go from a mobile up approach. And what I mean by that is when you develop a responsive application, if you start setting basic things like headings, heading sizes and padding, and text width, say I'm building a navigation control, and I need to put my headers and my sub items, and they need to go full width on the mobile device. So I start doing that, and I get that all set up. When I move to the next breakpoint, all I really need to do is change the deltas. I'm not necessarily overriding a whole lot of spacing or sizing or percentages. I'm really just changing the fact that I want my headers to be, instead of 1 EM, I want them to be 1.5. Or if I want to go from a stacked, a stacked view to a horizontal view. I'm making much fewer changes in my CSS, which makes it a lot easier for me to maintain and debug, and also make sure that I'm really starting to think about the user experience at the mobile level. The other thing to think about as you're doing this is, I'm using an example of a navigation control, but if you're building an actual application, it's really important to think about what it is that your users are trying to accomplish at different goals and show or hide things to help achieve those goals. So for instance, when I'm looking on my phone, right, and I'm on, say, social media, what am I actually trying to do? I'm trying to get quick updates. So I need my information presented to me in a quick and easy digest form. I'm also maybe looking to read an article. So I need access to that article. I need the ability to open it up in a browser window. Or I may be surfing Twitter and I need to be, I may need to tweet. And so I need access to those particular use cases. Sometimes I'm just looking for an address or a phone number. So really taking into account that the user isn't necessarily in exploration mode on their phone, and to think about what it is that they're going to do. So in addition to taking that mobile first approach, you also then start thinking about breakpoints. Okay, well, what does it look like on a phone? What does it look like on a tablet? What does it look like on a desktop? What does it look like on a 4K super wide monitor? And each one of those is set with a series of breakpoints. Standard breakpoints, and you can use the developer tools in any of your favorite browsers to sort of emulate what it's going to look like. It's also really important to think about transitions between those breakpoints, because your user may be building a navigation control and the text may look fine at 1024, and at 320 you want it to stack horizontally. But what happens at 900? Right? At 900, your navigation may start, overlapping each other and be 2 rows. Is that really what you want? So maybe at, 1024, you're still full width, but at 1000, you start reducing padding on the left, between the items. At 900, you remove the logo on the left-hand side, so that by the time you get down to 320, it's sort of a gradual shift in your transitions, and you really think elegantly about how your application changes from size to size, and while still maintaining the core functionality that the users need access to. I work on a Mac, and I have a super big monitor that I use. I actually use 3 monitors, and I have some things that I keep really small and I keep them off to on the side monitor. I keep other things on the large monitor, but maybe half width. It really depends on what I'm doing. So thinking about the use cases for your users and thinking about how different users may be interacting. Not everybody looks at everything full screen. And so at the end of it all, your web part should look great on every device at every size. And I know that's a tall order, because it is, and it requires a lot of forethought and a lot of thinking. But it's really important for us to make sure that we're doing our best as developers to really take into consideration what our users are doing, what they're thinking, and make sure that it's usable. And that's really what it all boils down to, is making sure that the users have a good experience. Now, I want to move on to another topic, which is very, very important to me, and that is of web accessibility. I had an experience once where I was in a session, and a developer was talking about a tool that he was building. This tool was an API explorer to let you sort of check and make API calls, and it was all web based. And now it's like the Graph Explorer. It was not the Graph Explorer. It's not part of the Graph team at all. This was just an anecdote that I heard, that I was talking with a friend about. And the developer stood up and said, do I need to make this API Explorer accessible to people with disabilities? Because that's hard. And the way we built it right now is really difficult. And I was really struck by that conversation, because that should never be the case. You should never be asking if you should make something accessible for all users. You should say, why isn't this accessible to all users? And really bringing home the fact that it is our responsibility as developers to make sure that the applications we build, that the tools we use, and that the tools we develop are all usable by developers and users of all abilities. And that's really it's not just for sighted users or users with no cognitive issues. It's your job as a developer to make sure that you can do everything you can to make sure that your site is accessible and usable by everyone. And to do that, we really want to do that by making sure that our application is usable. And there's a lot of different things that we can do. The first is by not assuming that all of your users are using a screen, a mouse, or a keyboard. I have the ability right now, I am sighted, so I'm reading my PowerPoint slides and I can see them. I can visually see the difference between the colors. I can see where I should be pointing. I know where the headers are. But not all users are like that. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we're following best practices and standards in order to make sure that everyone can use our site. In addition, depending on what country you live in, making sure that your applications are accessible to people with disabilities is the law. The US has has standards, but Canada and the EU all have levels of compliance that are legally required for you to make sure they apply to all public-facing websites. And as this field evolves, you're going to definitely see that applying to more internal applications as well, because you can't assume that all of your users, your internal company users, are sighted or don't have mobility challenges. So it's really important to make sure, because this is something that is going to start getting litigated, and you need to be in front of this. And so what are some of the things to think about when it comes to accessibility? The first is, just sort of thinking through, when people think about accessibility or disabilities, they think very tactilely. They think about physical disabilities. And that isn't necessarily as broad as, this is a very broad category. And to pigeonhole it into one specific spot does it a disservice. There are users with cognitive issues. There are users with eyesight issues. And that could range from having no sight to having limited sight to having color blindness. And so making sure that you sort of fit anywhere in between is really important. They could have auditory issues. In addition to those kinds of things, it's also important to think about the literacy level. As you are writing instructions for your application, think, are we working with non-native language speakers? Do we need bilingual instructions? What is the literacy level of our users? On the same sort of token as that, recognize that not everyone is on the latest iPhone with the latest version of the software. There are economic disparities there as well that come into play, where someone may have a 6-year-old phone and they're trying to access your site. I know we all make jokes about IE, but maybe that's all that someone has. And also thinking about bandwidth limitation. You know, in this modern age where right now a good chunk of us are all working at home, think about the limitations for bandwidth for you in your, you know, in your current situation, but also think of folks in other countries where they might not have access to super fast bandwidth. So how do we work with that? We can work with that by thinking very clearly about font style and size. You know, making sure that our colors and our contrasts are appropriate. There are checkers that you can use to check the contrast between different styles, between different colors. You can also really think about your writing style, or maybe have a writer work on an application with you. If you are using images or videos or alternate text, making sure that you have alternate text for that application, and also taking very clear taking very clear direction and using best practices around HTML and CSS and the work that you're doing there. So take into consideration this code. In this code, we're creating a header, and that header is 40 pixels and, you know, red, and a subhead that's 30 pixels in bold and blue, and then we've got body text here. As a screen reader comes through and reads this, it's going to literally read, this is important, this is a subhead, here's the body of the content. It gives the user no indication of where there's actually a header except for the content itself. So if that content said news articles, it wouldn't give anyone any indication that it is a header. Consider this, using just different standard HTML tags. If we have an H1 that says this is important, we have an H2 that says this is a subhead, and we have a paragraph tag with the body text. What this does when a screen reader reads it is it says heading 1, this is important. Heading 2, this is a subhead. And then it reads the text of the body text of the body for the paragraph tag. So your user really gets a very clear indication of the information hierarchy that they visually can't see. Now, a couple of notes on this. There should only be one H1 on a page ever. You can mix and match H2, H3, H4, but they do need to be sequential. The validators, there are many validators out there, but the validators start squawking if you use an H2 and then jump to an H4. So make sure that as you're using headers, you are not using them for layout. You're using them really to identify what the headers are. So what can you do? Because accessibility can be a big beast. The first thing that you can do is get more information. And there's a link to the web accessibility guidelines at the end of this presentation. And you can get more information. You can validate your code. One of the biggest things that flags in the validators is using broken or non-standard HTML, putting elements where they don't belong. The other is checking your code for accessibility issues. And Firefox has an amazing developer tool plugin that you can use to check accessibility issues. Chrome has a couple of more plugins that you can download to check things for visual contrast. Run your full pages through accessibility validators, whether that be on your, in your dev tools or in a web service tool. And if possible, try to test your application with real users, because it's one thing for us to do things academically in our test environments and with our validators. It's a total other story to actually test it with real users with real disabilities. Okay, and so in talking about responsive design and accessibility, we're talking about things that we can do. Well, what does Microsoft give us to help make this a little bit easier to create a good user experience? And that tool is the Fluent UI. Now, the Fluent UI, you might say, it was previously called the Fabric Core, or the Fabric Core React, or the Fabric React UI Fabric. It's recently been rebranded to Fluent UI to sort of match with the new functionality that Microsoft is coming out with. But right now, there haven't been any major developments since the core other than the rename and the new NPM package. So for those unfamiliar, what is the Fluent UI? The Fluent UI is a design language and that's provided by Microsoft. And what that really is a fancy way of saying that if you have multiple products or multiple sites, that they should look similar. A design language is a common set of styles to use to create consistency across all of those products or all of those sites. It's also it's a collection of different frameworks. So it's a grouping of CSS tools or JavaScript tools to help ensure consistency. It's a way in one place to bring together React, jQuery, PNP.js, sort of bring things all together to make things easier for developers to use. It also provides a set of design tools and design guidance. You know, a lot of times I work with designers who are agnostic, you know, tool agnostic. I don't need to know SharePoint. I just need to know user experience. Well, that's a nice thing to say, but the reality of it is that a tool like, you know, Office 365, Microsoft 365 has a lot of guide rails. And the Fluent UI provides design tools that help share where those guide rails are for designers and to give them an idea of what it is that they can update and what they can't. And finally, it's a set of components that can be reused across different applications. There's a whole slew of React components that are part of the Fluent UI React. And you can use those so that your text box that you put in your web part looks just like the text box that the new form uses on a SharePoint list, which looks very similar to items in Office. So you get the idea that it's that consistency of branding, framework, and design that starts to create this common set of languages that your user doesn't need to decode every single time they go to your web part. Okay, now this is sort of a crash course in the Fluent UI. I do other sessions that are, you know, much more specific deeper dives into the Fluent UI and talk about how to use that, but we're not going to do that today. If you're interested, please reach out and I'm happy to talk to you about that. Just a few tips and tricks on the Fluent UI. It does, right now, all of the font sizes are in pixels, which means that they are not responsive to the change. They're not variable font sizes, so they don't change depending on the size of the screen. So if you do want to use the Fluent UI and you're going to use the CSS variables for the fonts that they're using, just be aware of that. You'll need to use media queries in order to actually change the font sizes. The other thing is that there are a bunch of pixel values that are in there for like padding and text sizes, so just be aware of that. Out of the box, it's not connected to themes. So if you want to connect your web part to themes, I always make sure that I do, because you may design a header in your web part to be blue, but if you've got it on an orange site, that may clash. And if your users want to use orange, you want it to sort of fit seamlessly with their site. The Fluent UI comes with a grid framework. However, that doesn't work so great in SharePoint. I tend to bring my own because it's use a bootstrap or something like that. It's a little more lightweight. And it doesn't play well, the grid framework doesn't play very well with SharePoint. Another thing to think about is if you're creating a React app using the Fluent UI React components, it also, and using the Yeoman generator for Microsoft, the Microsoft Yeoman generator, it actually loads two versions of the Office Fluent UI. I keep switching back and forth from Fluent UI and Fabric, but it is the Fluent UI. It loads both the core and the React version. You don't need the core version, so you can uninstall that because that leads to bundle bloat. And so make sure you're reviewing your bundle. And finally, as we talked about themes, there is a built-in JavaScript object that if you are interested, you can see all the names of all the slots and all the colors associated with that, but just going into your console and grabbing the global variable _theme state _, and that will help help you understand what colors are coming from where in your theme. Okay, so that was kind of a whirlwind, and I thank everybody for sort of keeping up with me. So today we talked about some basic principles of user experience design. We talked about, making sure that things are consistent, that we're reducing our errors, that we're trying to, make things stable for users to see and expect consistency. We talked about the tenets of what makes a good user experience. We talked about making sure that our content is consistent and readable and intuitive. We also talked about responsive design and taking a mobile-first approach to building your HTML and your CSS. We talked about the importance of web accessibility and making sure that your site is accessible to users regardless of their ability and what devices they're using on their to work with your application. And finally, we took a look at the Fluent UI and the design tools that Microsoft is providing to help us make our development lives a little bit easier. And so I thank everybody for sticking with me for this hour. Here's a few resources of things that I talked about. The article that I used for the 10 usability heuristics from the Nielsen-Norman group. Also a link to the web accessibility guidelines. So if you're interested in looking at your web application and getting some understanding of how you can be a better ally to people with disabilities as a developer, you can check that out. Also, and I like to put this in all my slides that relate to design, is a link to the SharePoint lookbook. It's a really great way for you to see the art of the possible and to even provision some of those items, those sites in your tenant and start taking them apart and see how they work. I also provided a link to the Fluent UI website where you can understand how to get started using it. And also a link to my Twitter, which is SPDCP. So at the end of this, I'm going to take the slide deck and post this with a link via my Twitter. So with that, I want to thank you, and I appreciate your time today, and I hope everyone has a great day.